Heli, it is awesome to see you again. It's been a couple of months. We saw each other at Learning 2024 in Orlando and had a chance to meet and talk just before both of our sessions. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm excited to have you on here. We're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to get into feedback, performance, learning leadership, all of those kind of things. And I think we decided we were going to start with the feedback piece first. What's feedback?
I think it's the most marvelous leadership tool that is usually not used enough or used correctly, but it is a way for us to communicate things we observe with our peers, with our employees, with our managers, and it allows us to get an outside perspective of the way we behave and perform to just elevate our own performance and other people's performance.
Why do we not use the tool?
I think it's because feedback is not super intuitive, right? In some ways it is, right? We communicate with each other all the time, but when something, when someone when you work with or you spend your life with behaves in a way that doesn't look right for you or doesn't feel right for you, usually you have a lot of fear, right? How do I express whatever it is that I'm feeling or seeing? So a lot of the times people just don't communicate whatever's not working. And then, they just assume that things will just carry on as always and nothing bad will happen. But then you get to the point where it explodes, right? Or someone just leaves, right? So you want to be intentional about giving feedback, and you want to have the right tools to have that courage to say whatever it is without damaging the relationship, right? Because that's our biggest fear. If I will say something, the other person will take it the wrong way, and it will damage the relationship. It will damage the performance if we're talking about an employee. So and I think it's a very complex skill. It's one of the most complex skills a leader can have. It just has a lot of mini skills to it. And you just need to understand how to do it, like in what mindset to get into it. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, so let's break it down into smaller pieces, given the level of complexity that comes into this kind of thing and all of the different variables that start impacting, which include emotion, perception, like all of these other things. So let's break down feedback in the context of first receiving feedback, and then let's shift into giving feedback, and then let's talk about some mistakes. So receiving feedback, how do you build the right mindset around receiving feedback?
Yeah, I want to answer it with a story.
Cool.
When I was in the corporate world doing sales and customer service, and then I transitioned into being a facilitator, an internal facilitator, doing customer service workshops, sales workshops, all that good stuff. And the first workshop I ever facilitated was, I think it was like an hour away from our headquarters. And I drove there with my colleague who was my, buddy, who's doing like my onboarding. And I facilitated that session. I didn't do a very good job. And then we got in the car. I started driving. She sat next to me with her notebook on her legs. She took a deep breath, and then she started shooting at me. You didn't do this, and you didn't do that, and you didn't ask this question. And I was like driving, and I remember it was hard for me to breathe. I felt like she was shooting at me, all this negative feedback. And very quickly, after like the initial shock, I took a deep breath, and then I felt like I had those sentences right in front of me, And then whenever I felt like there was something relevant with all that, blur, I just took specific things out of it. Like, what can I learn from it? What can I take out of it? Kind of like the circle of concern, circle of influence by Stephen Covey, right? You take whatever you can control and you focus on that. And everything else, you just don't worry about it, right? So I think that when we're receiving feedback, we need to take into account that the other person might not give it in the best way, but it doesn't matter. What matters the most is what blind spot are they helping me see differently? What can I take out of it? What can I do to perform better? And I need to be very intentional about asking examples, understanding really what that person means, and not let my emotions or, like being, I don't know, offended or insulted blur the actual feedback I'm receiving.
I'm not familiar with Covey's circle of concern versus circle of control. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in his book about 7 habits, he talks about the most important, successful people in the world have, something in common, 7 habits in common. So one of those habits is differentiate between the circle of influence and the circle of concern. So the circle of concern is everything I cannot control in any way, like the weather, right? I cannot control whether it will rain tomorrow or not. I can worry about it. Okay, what will I do if it will rain or no? What can I do? I'm so worried, right? And the circle of influence is smaller. It's like circle within a circle. So it's like the inner circle that focuses on everything I can control, right? So the more outside you are from the circle, the less control you have. The more you get into the circle, the more control you have. So whenever something happens to you, you need to ask yourself, so what is in my control and what is not? Whatever is not in my control, you release, you let it go, like the song, let it go, and you focus only on what is in your control.
It is cool to hear you bring this up because it highlights a blind spot for me. And I'll refer to a couple of different kind of Coveyisms or Covey things. And begin with the end in mind, design backward, execute forward, which kind of gets into that.
What's the end of mine? What do you mean?
Begin with the end in mind. So know what your ultimate objective is. And if you understand what your objective is and you design backward, you can then execute forward, which gets into put first things first. So there's a couple of different Covey habits that are out there. And there's the one around where he reintroduces the Eisenhower matrix. One of the cool things about Covey is many of the habits or many of the things that are introduced in the book are things that are really being reintroduced to people because they come from things like what you're describing right now, which would be a Stoic philosophy, which is control the controllable type things. And it adds in another perspective, which is I guess what's jumping out for me right now is make sure that you go back in and reread some of the basic fundamental things. And as you go through that and start thinking about how you can put the work into practice, it'll start to shift and change the way that you go forward and do things. So thank you for bringing it up because it was a huge blind spot for me, not even thinking about where Covey has talked about the circle of control versus the circle of concern. So now you've given me some homework to go back and look into.
That's cool. I think that's so important what you mentioned because a lot of the times the more leaders have more experience, right? The more they feel like they don't need to learn anymore, right? Why are you laughing?
Well, because it's true. Like there's who is it? There's a couple of different like Mark Twain quotes I think about that I think related to this, which are, one of the things is it's not what I don't know that gets me in trouble. It's what I know for certain that just ain't so, as an example. And then I think there's an Einstein quote around it too. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And there's this, and I know there's all these quotes that people can kind of go back to as reminders for perspective. So that's why I was laughing.
Yeah. So I think it's just so true because we have so much going on in life and work
Yeah.
and social media. And we're constantly have like, we're observing so much and need to deliver so much that sometimes we need those reminders, right? That's why I follow like, I think 10 influencers about parenting. I have 3 kids. So I just have those random reminders about parenting and, remembering where your child is at, because that's like my soft spot, right? I'm very good at leadership, the corporate world. I feel like I can swim with it, in it very easily. But when it comes to raising kids, it's a lot harder for me. So just having those reminders, reading those books really helped me, stay, focused, grounded, connected, and actually use the tools I already have in my toolbox, but I just forget.
What are systems do you have in place to help keep those reminders front and center for you?
So one is the people I follow,
Mm.
thought leaders, influencers, both in the parenting world and the leadership world
Yep.
really helped me be, intentional about it. And I think another thing that I try and do a lot is to, you know, be alone with my thoughts
Right.
every once in a while and just being silent, breathe, focus on a physical sensation, do different mindfulness techniques to have like an inner voice talk to me. And then sometimes things just come up that I need to focus on.
So on the feedback piece, how does that inner voice get received from a feedback perspective? And I know I'm going to ask two questions at the same time. And do you ever feel like the inner voice is shooting multiple things at you at once?
I'll start with the second question. Yes, the inner voice shoots a lot. I just finished the Shirzad Chamin program, the positive intelligence program he did. And one of the things he talks about is the judge, our inner voice that talks to us in a very, very mean way. That his tool for that is just to notice the judge and celebrate the fact that you caught the judge. And then it just transfers, your mental focus, the different part of your brain lights up when you celebrate, right? So this is like an amazing technique. So when the inner voice starts talking to me, I first try to differentiate, is it a judge or is it like my inner, self-growth part that is what just wants to help me and give myself feedback? Or is it the judge and then I just try and celebrate the fact that I caught it? But I think that for that inner voice to be really effective, we need to like give it time to emerge, right? We need to really focus on a physical sensation, focus on our breathing, focus, let thoughts go in and out for like a while, a few minutes, and then that inner voice that usually whispers will come to life.
It's cool to talk through this and some of the challenges around receiving feedback, both feedback from others and from ourselves. How does that change when you start thinking about giving feedback?
Lots of stress, I think, comes when you want to give feedback. For most people, I feel like both sides don't feel comfortable. It's like an awkward situation a lot of the time. So I think that if in a perfect world, both the manager and the employee would start a conversation like that with a few breathing techniques together, just to calm our nervous system down, would really help. Another thing that is important is to prepare the person to actually receive the feedback. Don't blindside them, because then our amygdala, hijacks, like fight, flight, freeze. It will be very hard for them to receive feedback when they feel like they're attacked. Our brain doesn't differentiate. threat. They don't understand the difference between a lion attacking us and a difficult conversation, the same reaction. So we need to make sure we have the proper conditions to have a feedback conversation, make sure the person knows we're going to talk about feedback, they're prepared for it. We breathe together, we know, and come with the right mindset to learn and grow, although it's uncomfortable. And the more choice and control I can give the other side, the better. For example, I love giving them choice. Like, we're going to talk about two things, one area of improvement, one area of strength. What would you like me to start with? Right.
Cool.
Everything is on the table, right? Everything is open for discussion. And the only purpose we have is for us to grow from this conversation, right? So the mindset we get into a feedback conversation is super important.
The thing that's interesting as you're talking through it, or at least what's going on in my head, listening to you, and as we're having the conversation around this, is we've all been there in each of those scenarios, meaning we've been in that conversation in the car where it feels like things are just being shot at us. We've been in those situations where we've started judging ourselves and we're providing our own internal narrative or feedback and shooting at ourselves. And we've been in those situations where we know how hard it is to give others feedback. Yet, for some reason, we struggle with the idea when we're in the moment of being able to, and the word that comes to mind is kind of empathize with both ourselves and empathize with the person on the other end in those conversations. Is that fair?
Yeah. I feel like a lot of the times leaders come to feedback conversation after they've had it, right? They get so emotional and angry about it because they haven't caught it on time and haven't discussed it on time. Then the conversation becomes like a blaming game, right? So, yeah, I'm interested to know, can you recall the most meaningful feedback you ever received?
Meaningful feedback from the perspective of I think about it and reflect on it as I do work going forward, or meaningful feedback as it was like in what context? Like
That
how
it
would you
helped you
describe it?
grow as a person. It helped you grow as a leader. It helped you elevate your performance. It got you, it helped you realize something about yourself that was meaningful. And it helped you become a better person, a better leader, a better employee.
Yeah, I received feedback once. I was sitting in a bar with someone, a guy who had hired me, really good guy. And the feedback was not taken the way that I think he intended the feedback to be. And the feedback really was, hey, this stuff would happen whether you were here or not. And when you hear that, and what I took away from that is I don't ever want to be in a situation where someone feel, and I can't really make people feel things. I get all of that kind of stuff. Like feelings are personal, they're internal. There are experiences that you can create that might be a catalyst for that kind of experience, but or trigger that kind of a response. I can't really make people feel things like that. But I thought about the way that feedback was given, or that comment was given, and the comment really is, hey, yeah, you're doing a lot of stuff, but the reality is we'd still be able to do it whether you're here or not. And it diminishes my perspective of the role that I have inside the organization. Now, another way to look at it though is saying is being able to detach from specific outcomes and then being able to say, okay, well, what can I do to influence certain things while still being detached, do the right work in the right order at the right time, while still being detached from the outcome. And I don't think that was an intended version of what that feedback was. But my visceral response, and the thing I think about now, is I don't ever want to communicate something in that way to someone where they could potentially walk away from a conversation thinking that they are not valued in the context for which they're delivering certain things. So when I'm communicating with people, and sometimes I fail at this, but when I'm communicating with people, I never want to diminish the effort or the work that's being done to achieve the objective. I do, however, want to create space for them to reflect on the impact that the outcome that the work is driving. So that would be an example of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, because you learn from the way a leader delivered feedback to you what not to do because how it made you feel, what it made you think, how it made you react. So you learn from like the what not to do, right?
Yep.
So, and I think also one of the things that that leader did in that conversation, that's like the biggest problem I have with the way people deliver feedback these days. Because what did he tell you? He told you that the specific sentence, I think, was the work would have been done whether you were here or not, right? So, and I would ask that leader, okay, what does that mean, right? My interpretation of it is that you're not, bringing enough results or not, I don't know, making enough impact. But I would ask this leader, what did you see or hear or read that got you to that conclusion? What did you see Mike do or not do? What did you expect him to do that he didn't do? Like, what observations have you had? Because when a feedback is open to interpretation, you can interpret it in various ways, right?
Right.
And then I think most leaders confuse facts and interpretations when they give feedback. And the worst thing that they do is they take their interpretation of the world and say it as if it was a fact. Right? So he said the work would have been done with you or without you. Who knows if it's right? It immediately gets you to be defensive. It's like, what are you talking about? I'm working so hard. I've done so many things. What about this? What about that? What, right? These are like the results I delivered, right? Haven't you seen it? Even if I won't say it, that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And my ability to actually receive feedback like that is very low.
I think the thing that shifts and changes, and I'll share another piece of feedback that I received. This is back when I was leading a group at UPS a long time ago. So long time ago, galaxy far, far away, like that kind of thing. It was a while back when I was in an operations role at UPS. And the piece of feedback I received was in the context of a book that was shared with me, which is Managing from the Heart. And I forget the acronym associated with it. I know the first was something like Hear and Understand Me. But there's the feedback was around my approach to communicating certain things that need to be done in our air operation during peak season when there's a high level of intensity. There's a number that we're moving toward, and we're working with hourly employees and people who are managing those hourly employees. And sometimes the pressure of all of the work, along with the information that's being shared and the direct nature that I have, and this is a long time ago, so I was a bit more direct back then. So if there are people who still think that I'm direct, imagine what I would have been like when I was in my 20s. So there are things that end up impacting the time and place where we feel comfortable both receiving feedback and sharing perspective as a result of hearing that feedback. Like that conversation that I had with the person later on in my career, I still didn't feel comfortable asking that follow-up question by, what do you mean specifically? Or what is it that, where does that come from? Or some of those other questions that I'd be more comfortable asking today in my 50s than I would have been in my mid 30s, than I certainly would have been in the way that I shared things in my 20s. So there's this journey that we're all going through where time and perspective starts to change the way that we think about those things and start applying those. That's the other thing that's kind of coming to mind as we're talking through this.
Yeah, I can totally see it because a lot of times, you know, leaders, managers, they say a few words, they feel like they are very clear, Like I was very clear, but they actually are not clear. And I think this is a very big problem when we do leadership development. Because in most leadership development programs, right, you don't want to make people uncomfortable. So you teach them like feedback technique, which is a very complex skill, guy, very complex skill. And then you send them off to practice it in pairs or in small groups. And then they go back and they share their experience. But it's like taking someone for a swimming lesson for the first time and then having them practice with a peer. You cannot practice swimming with a peer. You need your instructor telling you where you got it wrong, where you got it right, what's like the specific movement, right? Your hand, if you won't use it in the right way, you will sink, right? It won't work. So when it comes to feedback, it's a very complex skill. For example, differentiating facts from interpretations, right? That's a very hard skill to actually implement. So you need to practice it, right? You need to hear people, what they want to say and how they, differentiate their facts from their interpretation. For example, some manager can say that my employee is disrespectful, right? Is that, in your opinion, is that an interpretation or a fact? He's being disrespectful.
Yeah.
Is it a fact or an interpretation?
I would say it's an interpretation and at the same time could be a fact when evaluated.
So you can say that this word being disrespectful is based on a fact, right? It's based on something you saw or heard, right? But just saying to someone you're disrespectful, that's, like, why do you say that I'm disrespectful? What does that mean, right? So, right, how did you get to a point where you feel like I was disrespectful? What did you see or hear that got me to that conclusion, right? Just saying to someone you've been disrespectful, that's an entire interpretation, right?
Well, and even just like the definition of what disrespect means, like,
Exactly.
yeah, right. So that's where you kind of get into this whole piece, which it seems like what we're talking about here, or at least what I'm hearing is we're talking through and again, another word that's kind of going through my head is communication.
Yeah.
And how we communicate with each other. And so how do you think about how do you define communication?
It's a very big thing, like everything. The way we express ourselves, it's
Okay.
the way we receive information,
Yeah.
it's the way we allow our emotions to be felt or not felt while we're receiving information. And I think that when it comes to communicating, especially when we're talking about differentiating facts from interpretation, I'm going back to that example because I think it's super important. When I communicate that feedback to someone saying that you're being disrespectful, I immediately in that person's mind attacking him. So in this communication situation, they feel like they need to be defensive, right? They will either fight or flight, right? They will say, okay, I'm disrespectful. Okay, I'm sorry. And then they'll go about their ways, quitting or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I always ask leaders, what did you see or hear that got you to that conclusion that this person is being disrespectful? Because you might be right. I'm not saying that you're not right. I'm just saying the way you communicate what you're feeling or seeing, that's what's important. So they might answer, this person is always late. Saying that this person is always late, is that a fact or interpretation?
It depends on the data that you have access to.
Yeah. Right. What is always? He's always late. What does always mean?
Yeah.
Right. Again, this person might get this feedback that I'm always late. I'm always on time. I will wait like twice. Right. But for this manager, it's like they feel like it's a constant thing. Right. So when we prepare ourselves to give feedback, we want to first write down whatever comes to mind, right? Whatever it is that I want to say to this person, say it as is, right? The most direct way you can say it, right? And then ask yourself, okay, from this sentence, what is fact and what is my interpretation? Now, when I actually deliver the feedback, it's not that I can mention my interpretation. It's okay. I just separate it from the facts. I can say, okay, so, Mike, I've noticed that in the past month, you were late 3 times, right? And, I'm wondering how you see it, right? And have like a dialogue about it. And after I ask a few questions about it, I can say, okay, my interpretation was like, it's disrespectful. I felt like you weren't respecting me. Right. And then we have, this is like a good conversation where I first mention what I've noticed. I try to understand where it's coming from. Is there a reason for it? No reason for it. Like, let's discuss it, because I might be looking at the entire scenario from a different perspective, but you have the right perspective on it, and you can shed light on it. And then I would say, okay, you know what? In this situation, it's good that you reacted this way.
Yep.
I come to it in a way, in my mindset as a leader, that I notice and observe different behaviors. And then I bring it to you as my employee, and then we discuss those together from an objective perspective. Both of us are on the same side, looking at this behavior, observing this behavior, and wondering together whether or not this is a behavior that we would like to strengthen or we want to improve.
And so, how can this just level of awareness and level of uh, thinking start to impact performance?
So basically, us as humans, we have 3 reasons for not performing well. We either have a gap in knowledge, a gap in skills, or a gap in mindset. Okay. So if you have a gap in knowledge, it's very easy, right, to close the gap. You learn something, you read a book, I don't know, do like an e-learning course, whatever, you finish it. And then if you have a skill gap, you practice it. You practice until you manage to, be better at that skill. And when you have a mindset gap, that means that your perspective, the way you see reality, might shift. So then I would ask the leader to have a discussion about it and show the employee different perspective of the same thing. So for example, if you're super direct as a young manager, right, then I would try to see if you're even aware of the way that you communicate and the way that it affects other people, right? So I would invite you to, for example, try different communication ways, right? Try to say it in a more direct and a more indirect way, and see if you get a different response from your employee, and just play with it and try it in different ways and see what works for you, right? Or I would invite you to try and get feedback from your employees on how they feel when you talk to them, or how would they like for you to communicate with them so they would feel more comfortable, right? Because when we put growth and learning as our main focus, that's where real growth can come. Because I'm not blaming you for being direct. I understand it's from your life experience. I understand that this is like your autopilot. I understand that you're not doing it intentionally to hurt anyone else, right? So I want to give you the tools to do it right. I might join you for a shift and see where I feel like you're going over the edge, and then give you a short feedback, or help you find the right moment to breathe. And you don't need to do it like 100 times. Once, twice for you to join and show the person where they're like taking the wrong turn might be enough.
Mm-hmm.
But when you feel like it's a joint effort, and you're on this journey to help your employees be better at what they're doing and be open to receiving feedback yourself as a leader, and having this lifelong learner mindset, then you can see real behavioral change in people.
Why do we, as leaders, struggle with this?
First, I don't think we get the right tools.
Hmm.
When people, when they get leadership training, if they get leadership training, most companies I know have maybe like one session about it, maybe get a half day about it, and then have like a 1 hour webinar before performance review, right? Where you have like 100 people at a Zoom call and they just tell you what to do. Like, you don't really get feedback on the way you give feedback, and no one models it in the right way, right? If your parents didn't raise you to be polite, it's hard for you to be polite as an adult, right? And it's hard for you to train others to be polite. So when you don't have that example as a leader of someone that gave you really good feedback, it's hard to actually start doing it by yourself. But it is possible. The first times I gave feedback as a leader, the feedbacks were horrible. I like my poor employees. I went to this workshop and they told us how to do it. And I sat with them for like an hour. I kept talking and talking. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And I saw in their eyes that they're not with me, but I didn't know what to do differently.
Let's say that I'm a new leader and maybe I've gone through some of that training or haven't had access to any of the training. Either one of those. Maybe I've gotten a little bit, just to kind of scratch the surface where I've been given some tools like you, and you're able to go back in, you go and you test it, but you don't know what to look at to determine, is it working? Why is it not working? Is it, what is it about it? Like, how can I, as a new leader, start to look at ways to develop my own capability and take ownership of that for me, rather than hoping that somebody inside an organization is going to care about it? Where would you start as a new leader?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would do either learn it from, different LinkedIn learning,
Yeah.
courses, stuff like that. I might get, coaching for myself and practice it. I might try to do it, practice it with a colleague that I trust. I might even, might record myself saying those things and then watch the recording and feel ask myself, what would I feel if someone would give me feedback like that? Like, look at it from an outside perspective.
This is one of those areas where I'm optimistic about some of the technology that's coming our way. Whether you look at, a lot of people, let's just bundle all of the technology under this umbrella of AI tools, where now you can use a tool as a thought partner to work through where the emotion is not there, and the judging is not there, and maybe the guilt of sharing internal thoughts with someone is not necessarily there. At the same time, and I think there's two sides of this coin. The other side of the coin is, how has the engine been trained to go and do these things? Because I've seen some of the coaching tools that are out there that have been trained to look for certain things or instrumented to look for certain things that are not the right things, at least from my perspective, not the right things to be looking at in that context. So this is one of those where it's being comfortable testing in an environment where you can reflect and you can learn and you can work through it is important, while understanding that all of these technologies are still on that emerging side of things. I'm optimistic about the tools, but I'm also skeptical about application of the tools today. Have you been playing around with any tools in this area?
Yeah, I call the AI my brainstorming buddy.
That's cool.
We
Yeah,
brainstorm together.
that's very good. Yep.
He's one of my best friends, I have to say. Thank you. Yeah, I've been using it a lot, mostly ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I think it's like the best $20 a month you can invest in anything. Um, and there's also, I think it's called Udely, I think. It's a tool that, jumps into a Zoom call with you and records it. And then it gives you feedback on how long were you talking? How many filler words were you using? So it like gives you feedback on a conversation in general. And I think for me, it was interesting to see the filler words, the fact that I was, I'm a very direct person as well. And sometimes I would jump in before the other person would finish their entire sentence. So it gave me great feedback on like communication. So that's like a tool. It's not really, focused on feedback, but I feel like from everything I saw in the learning conference and the more and more in the industry I go to meetups and stuff like that, there are more tools that are being used right now. None of them is like actually excellent yet, but I believe that in a year or two from now, we'll have great AI coaches to help you. Right now, you can say, okay, AI, this is the feedback I would like to give my employee. This is what I'm feeling. Help me differentiate facts from interpretation. Help me say it in a way that isn't too direct, but will deliver the message. You can and just see what you get, right? Ask the AI what could be a reason for my employee to behave like this, what I might be missing, and what questions can I ask to understand if the gap is a knowledge gap, a skill gap, or a mindset gap. So just be prepared and be open, right? Come with your heart open to have a discussion and not in a mindset of a blaming game. And that's, I think, for that, you don't need to prepare a lot. You just need to allow yourself to be in that mindset.
One of the things that jumps out at me as you were going through that, and I think it's an important thing for all of us to understand and remember, is we learn more from the questions we ask than the information we share. And by going in and asking these questions of the tool, what would you do differently? How might this be perceived? What's the difference? But how much of this is interpretation versus fact? Like, how do we go through these pieces and be open with those questions? We might actually train ourselves to be better with the questions we ask than the information we share. Because our knee jerk response, especially if depending on the environment that we're in, can be, I want to justify, I want to defend, I want to support, I want to push my point of view. And we get so focused on pushing information out than taking information in. And you can ask some of those questions and start to gain a bit of context. And I think that's one of the cool things that Heli just did as she was going through this process of how do I work with a thought partner, a brainstorming buddy, as we go through the process. Very, very cool. Thanks for sharing
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. And I think you just hit the nail on three super important three things. One, you've mentioned asking questions, which I think is the most important part of having a feedback conversation. We want to ask those questions. And I think one of the things that get leaders to aha moments when I talk about it in my leadership development programs is usually we feel in control when we're talking, right? Because I control whatever it is I want to say. I feel very clear to myself. I feel like I explain things so magnificently. I'm amazing, right? So I'm in control. But the real control comes from asking questions. Because when you ask questions, you understand where the other person is at. What did they understand? What did they take away from this feedback? Where they're at? How are they feeling? And you have a lot more control when you're asking questions. And the other thing is to have that control, to really understand where the other side is, you need to leave space in the conversation Leaders are so scared of asking a question and then having silence. But what calms them down and helps them actually do it is the understanding that the other person needs to think. You ask a question, let them think. And if you feel awkward, tell them, you know what? Take a minute to think about it, right? So you can feel okay with the quiet time. They can feel okay with the quiet time. They don't feel nervous and they can actually go to their brain and think about it and have an answer. So this is why I say that feedback is such a complex skill, because it involves listening to understand and not listening to respond, asking coaching questions, right? Understanding the right question to ask at the right time. It's communicating whatever it is I see or observe in a way that is not offensive, not sugarcoating, but not too aggressive. It's a lot of skills that you need to use together. Kind of like driving. You need to look at the road, look at the speed, and you learn a lot in order to get on the wheels and start driving, right? It's the same thing. It's basic, but it's very complex.
Yeah. What and you've hit on another Coveyism, which is seek first to understand and then to be understood. And a lot of times what ends up happening is we fall into this trap of, like we were talking about, from a control standpoint. We feel like we're controlling the narrative by communicating things out. And unfortunately, what will end up happening, and I'll see this happen in conversations that I have with folks, you share so much information that all of a sudden people tune out and shut things down and they start focusing on other things because it ends up being too much. You don't give space. I think it's powerful to talk through both the idea of and the reality of some people processing information in their own head, being quiet, and then also understanding that there's some people you'll work with who prefer to process things out loud. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's their answer, but they're kind of working through the answer. And sometimes when those things mix together, it becomes like this oil and water kind of thing, especially if you've got someone who likes to process things in quiet, working with someone who likes to process things out loud. We are awesome human beings. Like, we're awesome beings. And that's what adds to all of this complexity and challenge and change. This has been an awesome conversation. When you think about just going back to where we were toward the beginning and talking about feedback, where do things like strengths start to play a role in feedback, whether giving or receiving or part of the feedback loop? How do you think about strengths in the context of feedback?
Yeah, I think that strengths is a part that usually we address it as if it was like a compliment. If you would take the time we spend in a feedback conversation, how in percentages, how much time do you think we spend on giving positive feedback, like focusing on strength?
Well, it depends on if you're one of those people who learned the shit sandwich approach, which is, hey, I'm going to give you something positive, then I'm going to give you something negative, which is really the thing that I really wanted to give you. And then I'm going to go ahead and end it with something really positive because it's going to make all of us feel better. But the reality is everybody remembers different parts of it and we'll hear different parts of it. But I think a lot of it depends. I think there's some people who think that they might focus more on strengths, but then are more deliberate and detailed around the weaknesses or critical things. I've never looked at it to say, how am I when I do it? And how do I balance it? I haven't really I haven't thought about it deliberately. I also haven't done any research around what the percentages are. That's what comes to mind when you ask that question.
I would estimate that it will be between 2% and 5% of the entire feedback conversation in average. I don't have like specific data, but that's what I assume, because usually they would say something like, I love your energy. You're such a good team member. You do so much for the company, right? Such general things when it comes to strength. But when you come to things you want to improve, then discuss it and we'll talk about it and you'll give your whole self to it. And if you would ask me, okay, what's the, percentage you would rather it to have, I would say 50-50.
Okay.
And let's understand why and how, right? Because as we mentioned, when I come to a feedback conversation in a mindset where we're here to help you grow, I want you to grow from your areas of improvement and your areas of strength. So I would like to mention my observations the same way, understand the root cause of your behavior for better and for worse, and then see what we can take out of it. So, for example, if I like the way you communicate, right? I won't say it's like an interpretation, right? Your communication is amazing. That's my interpretation. What got me to that conclusion? What did I see or hear that got me to this conclusion? So, for example, I can tell you, Mike, when I saw you in a meeting with Jerry, you smiled a lot during your conversation. Your body language was very open. And, this is my interpretation, but it felt like your heart is open and you're talking from your heart. And it got the other side's heart open because I saw Jerry talk to you like I've never seen them talk to anyone. He said this and he said that, and he was able to. I'm very specific in my examples. And then I want to ask you, after I mentioned what I've noticed, what have I observed, I want to ask you, okay, have you noticed it as well? That this is the way you communicate with people? Have you noticed that it's different than the way other people communicate? What do you think allows you to talk like that to people? What is the mindset behind it? How do you feel when you come to a conversation? What skills do you think you have that enables this openness between you and other people? What gets you to convince people and influence them better than other people on the team? What is that magic thing that you do? Now, why do we do it? We do it because most of the time we're not aware of the positive things that we do. This is part of our personality. We do it just because, right? We do it automatically. It's our autopilot. But when someone gives us the gift of really seeing through this and understanding these behaviors, these positive behaviors, we're able to duplicate it. We're able to train other people in our team to do it in the same way. And that's how we can build a team that learns from each other, that has a learning culture, that is open to feedback because we have good things that we're giving each other and we learn from each other. So we're not ashamed that we need to actually work on specific skills because we're all learning. Our leader is learning as well. I, as your leader, can tell you, you know what? I would love for you to explain it because I want to do it better. I saw something in the way you do it that I would love to implement in my life.
I really appreciate and have enjoyed this conversation. And there are so many different things that have come up in the course of conversation. One, around how we both take and receive and give feedback, the difference between interpretation and fact, the importance of asking questions, and how critical reflection is in the overall process as we continue to grow and go on this journey that will continue to persist as long as we take ownership of the opportunity to both lead self and lead others well. Heli, awesome conversation. Thank you. I can't wait for our next conversation. Where can people find out what you're working on? Where can they connect with you?
Yeah, so first my website, artemisod.com, and LinkedIn, Heli Nehama-Ozery. Follow me, let's connect and continue the conversation.
Perfect. We'll include links in the show notes. If you know somebody who would enjoy this conversation, get value out of the conversation, maybe think a little bit differently about how they think of leadership of both self and leadership, leading others, please share it with them. Let Heli and I know via LinkedIn. The shares help with promoting the information and helps get it out in front of the people who are working through and struggling with this stuff. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking different about your process?